last of our travelogues for this season. We look forward to seeing you again in January for Rick Lawler's Exploring the Lesser Known China on Our Own. Make sure you've got a cup of tea and some cookies, and please be sure to add a few dollars to our donation box. It'll help fund more of our fun Parks and Rec programs like this one. Before we get started, I want to thank you for taking this moment to silence your cell phones, please. Our presenter tonight has recently presented on his travels to far-off destinations like Lebanon, Yemen, and Socotra Island, and he most recently got back from a trip to Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan.
Yes.
Those were the four, right?
Mm-hmm.
So tonight he's going to be talking about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and I just got a notification on a recent breaking news title here. It's North Korea launches suspected ICBM, South Korean defense officials say. ICBM means Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. It reads, it comes one day after Pyongyang fired a short-range ballistic missile into the waters of the east coast of the Korean Peninsula and issued a stern warning to the United States of a fiercer military counteraction to its tighter defense ties with South Korea and Japan. So that just happened about 40 minutes ago, so adding a little context to tonight's program. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Jake Strauss.
Thanks, Billy, and thank you all for coming. As you probably know, this is being live streamed on YouTube, and as we found out, the YouTube audiences have increased dramatically through the months. Because this will be watched both on this continent and internationally, I'll be referring to distances and measurements in both metric and English. Not many Americans go to North Korea. There's one lady here who said she's been to the south, and that's a common destination when you're dealing with Koreas. This program is actually from 2015, so it's a bit dated in time, but not necessarily in context, because things in that country tend not to change very rapidly. Another thing is that I never want to repeat or go to another destination that's been viewed here through a travelogue if I can avoid it. Unfortunately, the city never kept track of presenters and or destinations, and I know for a fact that someone else did give a presentation on North Korea a few years ago, but I wasn't able to attend. And again, I think with the difference in audience members and viewers, this should not be repetitive. If I also remember, it had to do more with the humanitarian aspect of the country. A couple of things about getting to North Korea. You can't do it now. Trump put a ban on the country when he was in office, and the more critical thing is that the country's been closed for 2.5 years since the COVID epidemic, and they have not reopened, and who knows when they will. As we all know, news from North Korea is filtered. We never get anything directly from them that's of any value, and that's certainly true when you're in the country. You have a lot of opportunities to view propaganda on every monitor you pass, in any restaurant, in any hallway in the hotels. They're everywhere. But as far as true news, not so much. And that's part of the attraction, I guess, of that country is that it's so far removed from what we consider our normal lives that it's like going to a different planet. As an example, when the Air China flight was landing at Pyongyang, I saw from my cabin window that the runway was lined with what looked like soldiers squatting on the ground. They weren't in formation, and the other thing is you never have people next to a landing airplane in any civilized part of the world. Well, in Korea, they did. And I thought that I knew what they were doing, and once we got through immigration and we hooked up with our guides / handlers, I asked the young lady, I said, "What are those guys doing out there?" And she says, "Oh, they're planting grass, one blade at a time. They don't scatter seed," and I saw the same patterns in lawns and greenways in Pyongyang. It had like a hair replacement weave, one blade at a time. So I think that I'll probably answer most of your questions as I go along, but if you have anything, please keep it in the back of your minds. There will be an intermission at about 45 minutes, just to give you an opportunity to get off these uncomfortable chairs. And with that, I'll stumble over here to do battle with the Christmas tree. And Drew has me hooked up with extra electronics here also, so bear with me for a moment. Okay, Billy, we can have the lights, please. North Korea is officially called DPRK, although it's not democratic, not the people's, and not a republic. As of 2020, the government stepped up efforts to root out things like, quote, dyed hair, earrings, jeans, and clothing with foreign lettering, unquote. Each gender reportedly has 15 approved hairstyles. For males, that does not include the leader's hairstyle. My trip started and ended in China. I arrived in Beijing the night of 27 May 2015 with reservations at this Holiday Inn, which the cab driver found partly with GPS and partly by luck and pluck. From my room, this was a view of the neighborhood. The notorious smog wasn't as bad as I'd experienced before. We'd been instructed by the tour agency to meet at their office in the afternoon, so I made it my mission to find the place prior to the meeting. This was one of several bike sharing stands I passed on the streets. After showing numerous locals my map to find the tour agency office, I finally met with some success down this narrow alley. I considered this a low-rent district and needed to be buzzed in for entry. There were at least a couple of businesses behind those doors, but Koryo Tours was my destination. Prior to COVID, the company was taking almost 2,000 visitors a year to DPRK. The manager has traveled there over 150 times. The most important document we picked up at the meeting was our DPRK visa. Since passports aren't stamped, this two-sided loose paper was my ticket into and out of the country. When you leave, the Koreans keep the visa. And I might also say that DPRK is actually one of the easiest countries to get into regarding given permission. Through the agency, one fills out an online form, you click in 50 euros and you're done. The thing is, you have to certify that you're not a preacher or a journalist. Friday, 29 May, was our departure from Beijing to Pyongyang. The gate for the Air China flight seemed to be in the most remote corner of Terminal 3. The choppy flight with poor service and bad food brought us to the single runway airport of DPRK's capital. From what I've been found online, they opened a new modern airport and terminal about a month after I left. The general area where we visited was here, excluding anything in the south. And I might also say that the images that are not mine are generally credited in the lower left and right corners. Due to the nature of where I was going, I've got a higher percentage of borrowed images than I usually do in a show. If you're ever on the space station looking for DPRK at night, you shouldn't have any trouble spotting it. It will be the dark area west of China, approximately the size of Pennsylvania. And let's go into a little history of the peninsula and DPRK. This is where we get into the more modern history part. Japan, of course, had a pivotal role in North Korea's Technically, the war is not over. There's an armistice, but there's never been a true end to the war. Again, everything is an estimate. The military, of course, is of great concern to everyone, including the US. But again, as far as true numbers, who knows? As far as the gross domestic product, that's a real kicker here. 1,800 US in the north to compared with 25,000 for South Korea. Now this is where it gets interesting, and this is part of the reason for the meeting prior to us even leaving Beijing. I had some paper books with me, and they definitely were scrutinized. This is an interesting one. The country has a lot of quirks, and as long as you follow the rules, you're just fine. No preaching, but it is okay to say grace at a meal if that's your habit. And I can personally vouch for this last one because I got shouted at for stepping on that planted grass. The politics of DPRK revolve around the Kim dynasty. It started with Kim Il-sung, then Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un. We've seen enough of the current leader to know what his temperament is like. Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, might be the one to be most concerned about since she seems to be a background powerhouse. The reception terminal at Pyongyang was this football field-sized, gloomy building staffed with no-nonsense Koreans where we met our 4 guides or handlers and bus driver. Our group of 6, all males from different parts of the world, arrived on the same Air China flight. Our base in Pyongyang was this 47-story Yanggakdo International Hotel. It's conveniently isolated on an island, so you cannot leave and roam the city. Tourists are placed in rooms facing the best parts of the city to the right in this picture. It opened in 1995, having been built by a French contractor, complete with a revolving restaurant at the top, which we did not eat in. Since the hotel was on an island in the Taedong River, we were free to wander and examine unique sights as these streetlights. They actually reminded me of the Canadian maple leaf. The hotel is said to have 1,000 rooms, but the 5th floor is not available on elevator buttons. It's reportedly reserved for staff and employees, so they don't mix unnecessarily with tourists when they're not at their stations. And my thought too is that there's probably monitoring equipment from all the cameras that abound anywhere you go in North Korea. Our rooms were on the 33rd floor, and the windows opened wide so that one could easily access the ledge and jump out. Hot water was available only from 10 p.m. to midnight and 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. This was the same hotel where the American student Otto Warmbier was caught stealing a propaganda banner in January 2016 and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. We only ate breakfast at the hotel. One of the stops in Pyongyang was at a microbrewery. It could have been this very one, since I remember the benches. There are at least 10 major breweries in DPRK, more than in the south, and countless microbreweries. In most other countries, there would have been sports on the TV, but here it was probably a propaganda video. Instead of pretzels, nuts, or chips, the common bar snack is dried pollock. Since I hate beer, the trip to the microbrewery was a waste for me, but the fish was tasty, although messy. In restaurants, seating was generally at long tables with shared dishes. There was always a variety of food, with kimchi being a staple. I'm sure there is a great divide between how tourists are fed and how the general population fares. I remember one lunch that consisted of covered dishes. It's called pangsangi, with a maximum of 12 dishes served in small bronze bowls. This was traditionally served to royalty during the Koryo dynasty. My experience with this is that I didn't like any of it. The most disgusting dish we had on the road and had to pay extra for was dog meat soup. Never again for me under any circumstances. Getting to the scenes of Pyongyang, this was a view in one direction from my room. Some have commented that high-rises in Pyongyang look like they're built out of Legos. The pyramidal building in the distance is the tallest in DPRK, the Rugyang Hotel, or 105 building, for the number of floors it has. I had a bird's eye view of the Taedong River below me, with gravel mining dredges that operated around the clock. There was no such thing as sleeping with the window open. In the far distant left is a communications tower we'll be visiting, and on the right side of the river, the Juchi Tower. To the left of the tower in the distance is the Rungrado 1st of May Stadium, the second largest by capacity in the world, holding 114,000 and occupying 51 acres. The largest stadium is in India. Pyongyang's air quality was many times better than Beijing's, but its main source of pollution is coal-fired thermal plants. It's quite remarkable that Pyongyang is the city it is today, given that it was bombed into oblivion, as this image from 1953 shows. The US Air Force dropped an estimated 250,000 bombs on the city, along with napalm. There's no shortage of political and inspirational material in DPRK. This mural, made of mosaic, depicts the president's speech upon returning to Korea from China after the country's liberation from 35 years of Japanese rule. These were two very common images, again being made of mosaic. Kim Il-sung, the father, is on the left with his son, Kim Jong-il on the right. It's no accident that the city's finest apartments are visible from here. Pyongyang is a city of apartment blocks and high-rises. I saw nothing that resembled a single-family house. These were not representative of Pyongyang and certainly not the rest of DPRK that we saw. The quality of the buildings varies with age and the status of their occupants. I saw solar panels outside some windows to supplement DPRK's inconsistent electricity. This area was our first stop in the city. Triumph Return Square is what we're looking at, and 90 degrees to the right across the boulevard is the Arch of Triumph, unveiled in 1982. It's taller than the arch in Paris and made of 25,000 blocks of white granite. The year 1925 indicates when Kim Il-sung left for China, and 1945 when he returned. To refresh your memory, we'll be taking closer looks at the two towers. The Juche Tower, at 170 meters or 560 feet tall, was completed in 1982 and is presumably modeled after the Washington Monument. It's the tallest granite block building in the world and also taller than the Washington Monument. An elevator goes to the top, but the operators closed it down when we were there because the electrical voltage was too low. Juche is the ideology introduced by Kim Il-sung. In an officially atheistic country, it may be called the religion of DPRK. Simplified, its core is that, quote, man is the master of everything and decides everything, unquote. The three tools from the insignia on the flag of the Workers' Party of Korea are displayed at this conference in 2014. Kaesong Park has amusement rides and the Pyongyang TV Tower with an observation deck and panorama restaurant. We didn't go up in the tower, but our handlers made us visit the amusement rides. There was a fee to enter the park, and if you wanted any rides, those were extra. The electricity went off midway, and without auxiliary power, workers had to back up the rides manually for those stuck on them. With a backdrop of modern Pyongyang and the river, this group was practicing for an upcoming event. One of the rules of photography was no pictures of unfinished buildings. As we were driven around, the lack of automobile traffic was apparent, particularly with the city's abundance of wide boulevards. But traffic police were still out going through the motions. Most were stylishly dressed, attractive young women who didn't want their pictures taken. It took me many shots to capture this one. The cell phone device hanging off her belt was a controller for the traffic lights. An unintended bonus of this picture are the nicely dressed residents of Pyongyang in the background. There are a few billboards for consumer goods in DPRK, one of the refreshing aspects of visiting. This advertisement was promoting the Peace Car, built by Pyeonghwa Motors. It was founded in 1999 by Sung Myung-moon's Unification Church, but since 2013 has been totally owned by the state. An online report says the factory produced 1,600 vehicles in 2018, although it has a capacity for 10,000. But peace cars aren't the only rolling stock out there. Witness this Land Rover. Kim Jong-un himself rides in an armored Mercedes sedan. The few vehicles are reserved for officials or the wealthy, which comparatively includes foreigners. Many city dwellers use mass transportation, such as this overcrowded trolley, or buses with long queues, which I witnessed. Single-speed bicycles are the primary forms of wheeled transport, and I saw a lot of locals walking in Pyongyang. We were treated to a ride on the world's deepest metro at 110 meters, or 363 feet underground. The descent on this steep and fast escalator was a scary ride, taking 3.5 minutes, and I was hoping the electricity didn't go off. The stations we saw were lavishly decorated. The underground stations were designed to serve as bomb shelters if needed during a war. Construction began in 1965, and the first stations opened in 1969. The system is said to carry 400,000 passengers on weekdays and 700,000 on holidays. And once you reach daylight again, the golden statue of a young Kim Il-sung greets everyone. He was the founder of DPRK in 1948 and served as its ruler until his death in 1994. This was the main ministerial building in Kim Il-sung Square. The translations on the top there are, quote, "Long live our glorious military first revolutionary ideal," and, quote, "Long live our democratic people's republic." The Korean Central History Museum at the north end of the square had few visitors. It reportedly houses 100,000 relics and artifacts. The square opened in 1954, and the building's design was inspired from the Soviet Union. This was the Ministry of Foreign Trade. The trolley bus was the only vehicle around, but that's not the case when the military vehicles and goose-stepping soldiers parade here on special occasions. 18.5 acres of granite were laid for this purpose in the heart of the city. Also near the square is Fountain Park, renowned for its beauty in buildings and grounds. It opened in 1976. The building in back is a grand people's study house with 34 hip saddle roofs capped with 750,000 green tiles. We were told this was a popular backdrop for weddings. 28 statues of women are performing a dance called snowfalls. Other fountains simulate natural waterfalls. It's also one of the places where it's required to buy flowers to present to their dead leaders. It costs €5 for a bunch of these. The Grand People's Study House in the rear opened in 1982 and took only 9 months to complete. It's a library with numerous computer rooms occupying 1.1 million square feet in a total of 600 rooms. It can accommodate 12,000 users a day, but we didn't go into the building. Locals over 17 years old can access the facility. While not taught here, DPRK has a school in the mountains to train computer hacking, and it's been turning out 100 cyber soldiers per year for over 20 years. The flowers we bought earlier were laid in front of this relatively new statue at the Monsudo Art Studio. It's also required to make a group bow. Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il astride horses were unveiled in February 2012. Pyongyang is proud of its trees and green areas. This park contained the native house of the birthplace of President Kim Il-sung. He was born 15 April 1912. These were reconstructed buildings, heavy with propaganda on the inside. This is one of the most sacred sites in DPRK and an essential place that all local Koreans will visit at some point in their life. The park seemed almost empty until this troop of school children came marching past. Another of our stops was the Munsudo Art Studio, a campus in itself. It opened in November 1959. It's one of the largest centers of art production in the world, employing 4,000 people, 1,000 of them being artists handpicked from the best academies in DPRK. Only artists belonging to this studio have permission to draw images of the leaders. Working as an artist here is a very prestigious profession. There are 13 creative groups working in 120,000 square feet of space. Until 2017, tourists could buy anything in the studio and have larger pieces shipped home. UN sanctions supposedly put a stop to that, but the North Koreans found workarounds on the international level. As a bonus stop, we were allowed to visit the April 25 film studio of the Korean People's Army, founded in 1959. With a name like that, it's no surprise that its specialty is military-themed films. This studio is one of 4 in DPRK. We were told that ours was the first Western group given permission to visit. The rehearsal in the parking lot had actors in period costumes. Mostly it was a propaganda stop showing that DPRK wanted to partner with, quote, progressive nations, such as China, Russia, and the UK in making movies. The US was not among those. The wind was knocking over the descriptive signs of their old equipment on display. In case you've forgotten about it, we're going to get closer to the tallest DPRK structure at 330 meters, 1,080 feet. It has the distinction of being recognized by the Guinness World Records as the tallest unoccupied building in the world. Construction of the 105 building started in 1987, but was halted in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was designed with 8 rotating floors, and the exterior was finally finished, but still not open as of 2020. Differing accounts say it was to have either 3,000 or 7,665 rooms. Some reports say the building is so dysfunctional it would have to be at least partially destructed and rebuilt to make it operational. Just around the corner is the Victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum. Like Fountain Park, this is also popular with wedding parties, one of which just happened to show up while we were there. The museum is devoted to remembering all the victories in North Korea's struggles against its imperialist enemies, namely the Japanese and the Americans. We had a local guide with portable amplifier to make sure we didn't miss anything. The main theme of the complex is to paint the war as American imperialist aggression against Korea that was victoriously thwarted under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. Leaving the entrance, one goes down some stairs to a display of captured US military equipment. Most of the displays are accompanied by graphic photographs with bodies. Several downed airplanes are displayed, along with helicopters. The prize of the museum is the USS Pueblo, moored at this spot since 2013. The ship set sail from Japan in early January 1968 and was seized 23 January by the Koreans for allegedly trespassing into their waters. One U.S. crewman was killed in the incident. Photographs of and on the ship were permitted, but not with Korean sailors in them. One interior corridor has scars from the battle. With so many bullet holes, it's amazing there was only one American fatality in a crew of 83. This chart depicts what happened on 23 January, according to the Koreans. The U.S. denies the ship entered Korean waters. One display is dedicated to letters of apology and guilt from the American crew. Once they were back on American soil, they recanted everything. The Pueblo was never decommissioned and is the only U.S. warship in captivity. The interior of the new museum is elaborate, with the intent of impressing and intimidating visitors. Photography is prohibited inside. There is an extensive wall of horrors depicting American atrocities on the Koreans. Nowhere in the museum did I see any credit to the Chinese and Russians for helping them win the war. To the east of the city is the Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery, accessed through a traditional Korean gate with 300 granite stairs leading to the monument on top, or a road which the driver took after he dropped us off. The memorial was completed in 1975 and covers 30 hectares, 74 acres. The red flag in the center is made of granite blocks. The cemetery is dedicated to the brave Koreans who fought the Japanese during the war. Each grave has a bronze bust. At least 2 women are buried here, the mother and wife of Kim Il-sung, and it's proper to place flowers and bow, but it wasn't a requirement for us. Part of the red granite flag is behind the statue. The complex is atop Mount Taesong at an elevation of 270 meters, 890 feet, giving an overlook of hazy Pyongyang and an amusement park in the foreground. From Pyongyang, we began a road trip to the Mount Moihyung area to the north. The road leaving Pyongyang was built with Soviet money and designed for military purposes. Now it's a ghost highway. The surface is rough and bumpy since they didn't use paving machines to lay the concrete. This stretch was asphalt, and repairs were made with a gang of men with shovels and pickaxes. It didn't take long to appreciate the vast amount of land devoted to agriculture and the thousands of people working at it. The 2 goats below the guardrail, along with the rest of the herd, had a herder to prevent them from straying. Amplifiers like this, and most much larger, were stationed along the roads, broadcasting inspirational music to the workers in the fields. Part of this route had a smoky backdrop of industry in the distance. With 83% of DPRK being mountainous and not suited for agriculture, It puts intense pressure on the remaining 17% to provide food to its residents. Air pollution is the least of DPRK's concerns. Our trip had been billed as a trekking tour, and we were at the start of our first hike. The mosaic map was pretty much meaningless since it had no elevation or distance markers in English. The area offers 55 kilometers, 33 miles of trails. One thing the map is correct about is the steepness of the terrain. DPRK trails aren't built with switchbacks. We were headed into the Mount Myohang area, which is actually a small mountain range. The name means, quote, mysterious fragrant mountain, after the mystic shapes and fragrances found in the area. The mountain is covered by mixed broadleaf and coniferous forest and protected in a 16,000 hectare, 62 square mile national park. We picked up a spry 67-year-old local guide and set out on what started as mostly paved trail. Sangwon Gate was a big rock with a narrow passage under it. We were steadily heading uphill. The route was still on cement and crossed the stream several times. That brought us to Pulyang Hermitage, founded in 1024. Half of its 24 buildings were bombed and destroyed by the US in 1951. Even with only 7 of its remaining structures, it's still one of DPRK's natural treasures. This caught my eye more than the building architecture. Drying in the sun was bracken fern, a staple of Korean cuisine. The pavement yielded to dirt, and we passed a patch of potatoes along with flowers. Then it began to get ugly, with bushwhacking and a 30% slope straight up. After descending, we stopped for lunch at this dry stream bed. The route after lunch required more steep climbing, and we took a break at this outcropping. Here was a grotto with Kumyang Hermitage tucked underneath. This borrowed picture shows the chains and post on the right, which is the only way in and out to keep visitors from falling over the cliff. The structure was built in 955 and restored in 1936. A couple of resident caretakers were there when we visited. A thin trickle of water dribbled out of the mountain, which supplied their needs, and I took advantage of also. This was the only water source along the route for about 3/4 of its distance. As a concession to modernization, they had a solar panel mounted on a movable stand to follow the sun. The views were nice, but I think it would be a lonely lifestyle with few visitors. From the Hermitage, we had to climb higher yet through forest before our final descent to the exit. The route down was mostly on unforgiving boulders that passed several waterfalls. The small amount of flowing water wasn't accessible. We ran into some other Westerners near the bottom, a group from an embassy that didn't need an escort. I found out that this was the norm for DPRK hikes: bridges and railings and stairs chiseled into the rock. For lack of better information, I think we went up one valley and descended another. After 15 kilometers, 9 miles of demanding hiking, we arrived at the campsite around 6 p.m., which was nothing more than a cement slab with tents practically on top of one another. Jan, the Norwegian, and I wanted no part of this camping experience and opted to stay in a nearby hotel. Meanwhile, one of our guides, who had not been hiking, was cooking supper on 2 single-burner butane stoves, something she called hot pot, a soup with veggies, tofu, eggs, and Korean blood sausage. For accompaniments, we had a spam-like meat, dill pickles from Vietnam, and olives from Malaysia. Jan and I spent the night at the 1970s vintage Chong Chong Hotel. The AC didn't work, but the bed was comfortable and they fired up the boiler for us so we could take a hot shower. Still in the same area, the next morning we visited the International Friendship Exhibition. There are 2 exhibit halls which opened in August 1978 and contain upwards to 220,000 gifts to the 3 Kims. It may look like the halls have windows, but there are none. With over 150 rooms, the interior of the halls cover more than 753,000 square feet, greater than 17 acres. The Soviet Union sent the most gifts, and the US the fewest. It was permitted to take photographs of the guards outside, but no photography inside. These gigantic doors are the entrance to the first hall. We had to surrender cameras upon entry, and booties were issued for our shoes. The building was climate controlled. This was our group with our local guide in traditional dress. She asked far more questions about me than I did about her or DPRK. It's no accident that most of the female guides are young and attractive. And while we have a moment, I'll identify the countries here. Canada, US, Australia, you know him, Germany, and Norway. Afterwards, it was time for tea and souvenir shopping on the upper deck. Miss Ree in the polka dot top was one of our guides. All DPR guides are university graduates, and 3 of our 4 had lived outside the country. And there's our first break here. Oh, jeez. Our trip continued from the mountain to the eastern coast via Pyongyang. Part of the route passed through different types of agriculture, the hillsides here covered with fruit orchards. It seemed that every possible scrap of ground had been converted to food production. In the foreground are painted rock circles with something planted inside them. Rural folks travel mostly by bicycle, and they can't stray far from their villages without permission. We stopped at a rest house at Simpyong Lake, formed by a hydroelectric dam. With such a beautiful setting, one would think the Koreans should have developed it more for tourism. Instead, on the way to the toilets, the dead leaders were keeping an eye on us. Offered here and at many other places was snake liquor, something I had no interest in trying. Getting closer to the port city of Wonsan, we stopped at quiet Sinjun Beach that had both a motel and a hotel. Some of the group were brave enough to check out the chilly water. You can see fishing boats in the left distance. Online accounts indicate there may be surfing opportunities here. Wonsan is a port city and naval base on the East Sea of Korea, otherwise known as the Sea of Japan, with a population of over 330,000. The port was originally opened by occupying Japanese forces in 1880. This ship used to provide ferry service to Japan, but that ceased many years ago, and the vessel now goes nowhere. Fishing boats use this as home port, the best natural harbor in the country. Further down the coast, we took a short hike in the Samil Lagoon area. Here we started seeing rock carvings which seemed to show up everywhere after this. There had been a sidewalk at one time, but when the great leader visited, he ordered it torn out and replaced with uneven paving stones. Legend has it that a king stopped here for a rest and stayed 3 days, captivated by its beauty. So it's also known as 3-Day Lagoon. This body of water used to be connected to the East Sea of Korea, but shifting sand and rocks blocked it off, so now it's a freshwater lagoon, the deepest in DPRK. From 2002 to 2008, this area was heavily used by South Korean visitors, but closed completely to them after that. We stayed at the Kumgangsang Hotel, built in 1958 with 240 rooms, but renovated by the South Koreans in the early 2000s. It's considered one of the best hotels in DPRK, but there were no lights in the stairwells and certainly no emergency lighting. I didn't trust the elevators, which is why I became acquainted with the inadequacies of the stairwells. I had a great view from my room as the sun was setting. Since we were approaching the DMZ, we had been warned about and seen increased military presence. We were now in the Mount Kumgyang area. Next morning was to be the longest and toughest hike, upwards to 25 kilometers, 15 miles. Again, it was difficult to get accurate information from the guides. The route traversed Kumyang Mountain, which translates into Diamond Mountain in Korea. There was an extensive list of regulations. Our route started by passing over mostly dry stream bed. This used to be a very popular area for South Koreans to visit, but after a fatal shooting incident in 2008, it was closed to those visitors and open to Westerners. The guides had brought some dried squid and pushed pieces into their shoes and tops of socks to ward off snakes. I have no idea if there were any in the area, and the only snakes I saw in DPRK were in the liquor jars. My favorite guide, Miss Ree, told me she had never seen the water so clear, and she had been here many times. This was the only refreshment stand we passed. Like everything else in DPRK, this was not free enterprise. The government was running this operation. The smart people brought sticks for this hike. The fellow in the back was a local guide for this area. The rugged scenery lent itself to many Kodak moments. This is a well-photographed spot with the Emerald Pool below and Gypsum Peak ahead. The geology consists primarily of two types of granite, 10 million years old. Along the trail, we found this man laboriously repainting the characters on the slab. The famous Koryong Falls had barely a trickle of water spilling over the cliff. Here's how the falls look during higher runoff. As we'd seen at other sites, there were carvings in the stone requiring artisans to have had to rappel down the cliffs. Koryong Pavilion is as far as most visitors go, and that included me, thanks to my rotten knees. Miss Ree and I retraced our steps to the restaurant, where I spent the rest of the day picking her brain about DPRK, her family, and personal life. The others went on with these views. Jan said the trail past the pavilion soon got narrow and brushy. The Koreans obviously spent some effort and money to fly in ladders and railings to deal with the steep terrain. I'm sorry to have missed seeing this firsthand. The highest peak in this area is 1,638 meters, 5,374 feet. Judging from the pictures, a lot of the route was on rock. At this point, trekkers coming from the other direction had joined our group. It looks more like a rock scramble than a hike. This was their high point, and they were joined by a group of girls who came in from the other end. Without the handrail, hikers would have a dangerous exposure here. From this vantage point, they had a view of the East Sea of Korea. I had been told about this long, steep ladder, but it certainly looks solid. And this was their parting shot. While the others were out in the hot sun, Miss Ree and I held court in the shade near the restaurant. She bought a gourd of freshly picked wild strawberries for $1, which we shared. We ate dinner at the restaurant we passed earlier in the day. The camping area for the night was a lumpy sidewalk outside the restaurant. Jan and I stayed in comfortable rooms at the hotel. The next morning, we relocated to the south for another hike. The drive brought us closer to the DMZ with many security checkpoints and armed guards. No pictures were allowed of the guards or security points. To the right is an example of not so state-of-the-art agriculture. It took 2 hours to reach the trailhead, partly because of the narrow, winding mountain road, and also because of the mandatory stops. This was the Inner Kumyang Mountains in Mongpok Valley. Our hike started in rocky riverbed, augmented by substantial bridges. My journal says we had a nice breeze on the ascent. Here was another bridge with rock carvings underneath carrying the date 1972. Unfortunately, I don't know what the significance is. Most of the route was on rock slabs. Our destination was a Buddhist hermitage perched on the cliff beyond the bridge. The other American took advantage of the surroundings for a fashion shoot of Miss Ree. She must have been in her early 20s, spoke excellent English, and told me she had attended high school in Peru. I'd found out earlier she was quite vain and didn't want any images with her eyes closed. I admired the skill and effort that went into the rock carvings, not only here, but throughout our tour. A 20-meter, 66-foot tall copper pole supports the one-room building. Situated in front of the Podak Grotto, the structure was built in 627 and rebuilt in 1675. Its design was intended to blend in with the surroundings. The interior was unremarkable other than the view, but the exterior had character. Many of the roof tiles had embossed patterns noticeable on the left. Back at the parking lot where we had lunch was another Buddhist temple. Waihonsu Temple was originally built in 670. Most of the buildings here now date to 1778. During Japanese occupation of Korea, they contributed to ongoing restoration work. This is the only one of Mount Kumyang's 4 great temples to have survived the Korean War. The others destroyed allegedly by American bombers. A token number of monks still lives here, but since DPRK is an atheist country, the government tolerates their presence as part of the country's cultural heritage and not for religious purposes. We had another short walk after lunch, complete with bilingual signs. It was a pleasant stroll through forest that brought us to this site with original Buddhist tombs. Since the temple was built in the 7th century, one might assume these are of the same period. Our exit point was this 3 Buddha relief called Sanbutso Gang. Note the swastika on the chest, a religious symbol for over 1,500 years. The path continued along a stream with some deep pools through the Manpuktung Valley. Local children were playing in the clear water. This was the most spontaneous interaction we had with locals, and they followed us some distance, shouting and waving. At the end of our walk was this Pegasus-style horse carved in the rock. I can only assume that the date of August 9, 1977 is when the carving was completed. On the way off the mountain in the bus, we stopped at a couple of spots to appreciate the scenery. The East Sea of Korea is beyond the rocks. The structure to the left center has significance, which was explained as we drove past it. It was built as a hotel, especially for visiting South Koreans to reunite with family in the north, but that stopped in 2008. Visits were allowed again in 2015 and 2018. A restricted road leading to the south is on the left, and there is also a rail line near here that terminates at the border between the two Koreas. Once we got back to Kyumgangsung Hotel, I noticed a flurry of activity across the street. These workers had turned a former patch of grass into another agricultural plot. To water the plot and the remaining grass, water had to be fetched by hand from a nearby spigot. There was no sprinkler system for this patch of green, just cheap labor. By Western standards, it's unimaginable that human resources would be used in this manner. We were finished with the Mount Kumyang area and moved to the Masik Ski Resort. That involved retracing our route along the coast and then heading inland to Masik Pass and DPRK's luxury ski resort. This resort and five-star hotel were built in 10 months by Army soldiers and opened in January 2014. The hotel was designed by the Pyongyang Architectural Institute and boasts 120 rooms. This was the best room I stayed in anywhere in my travels to this point. For those continuing to camp, they had to make do on the gravel parking area behind the hotel, accompanied by handlers, of course. The camping group had dwindled to 2 by now. The first stage cost over $35 million US. DPRK leaders had hoped to host some of the events for the 2018 Winter Olympics, but that didn't happen. It was early June with no snow, so we went on another hike. And no better way to get to the top than straight up the fall line. We were guided by the general manager of the resort, who said it was his duty to do so when I thanked him for leading us. The summit is 1,360 meters, 4,460 feet, and to supplement natural snowfall, they have snow cannons. DPRK wasn't able to buy a new Swiss gondola after that government blocked the sale due to Korea's nuclear tests, and they had to settle for a 30-year-old Austrian hand-me-down from China. Since the resort had only been open 18 months, Attempts to introduce grass on the denuded slopes was marginally successful. We spent only one night here and returned to Pyongyang. A trip south of the city took us to Serawan. The reunification highway south out of Pyongyang goes under the 30-meter, 99-foot tall Arch of Reunification, which opened in 2001. It depicts two Korean women dressed in traditional garb, one representing the north and the other the south, holding a bronze map of the peninsula. A 10-point plan was introduced by the North in 1993 to reunify the peninsula. It called for a one country, two systems model where a single state would be formed but governed separately by two administrations, one in Pyongyang and another in Seoul. And you have to remember that might have had some credibility had the father continued to live, but he's out of the picture and the son is mucking things up now. Leaving the city, we passed agricultural fields with crops other than rice. We were taken to a model cooperative farm growing a variety of fruits and vegetables called Apricot Hill. The nearest trees are persimmons with mulberry bushes below. The great leader had been so impressed with what they were doing that he gave them 4 new tractors in a country where most plowing is still done with oxen. The main difference between a state farm and a cooperative is that workers on a state farm are paid wages, while a cooperative sells 80% and keeps the remainder for themselves. We visited a private house that had its own vegetable garden. It was a tiny place by Western standards on 2 floors. The low ceilings upstairs definitely didn't accommodate Westerners. It was obvious that the residents made do with far fewer personal possessions than those in Western countries. I estimated the house had 65 square meters, about 700 square feet, on both floors. This was a kitchen area. They had a single burner electric hot plate, but the traditional cooking area was here. A fire of hot coals would be built in the firebox below the floor, which transfers heat to the raised area and the rest of the house. The ancient technology is called an ondol. This sketch shows the basics, starting with a fire on the right and the exhaust flue running underneath the floor. From the farm, we drove a short distance to the Serawan Folk Village, a reconstruction of traditional Korean architecture completed in 2008. The fact I only took 1 picture says enough about the commercialization of the place. Mountain Pavilion is perched on the rock in the center, and Kunyam Pavilion is on the right. In a different part of Serawan, we visited Songbo Buddhist Temple. It was built in the 9th century with renovations in the 14th century. The complex consists of 6 buildings, some of which are among the oldest wooden buildings in North Korea. This is the only temple that I remember entering. It was filled with bright artwork and unusual sculptures. Only about 60 Buddhist temples remain in DPRK. Many were destroyed by US carpet bombing during the war and never rebuilt. In the same area, we went on a short walk, but trails go further into the mountains. Pakyong Falls, dropping 37 meters, 122 feet, is one of the 3 most famous waterfalls in DPRK. It's a popular picnic place for locals, but swimming is prohibited. There was little flow when we were there. We spent the night in Kaesong, very near the DMZ. This was the former capital of Korea, going back to 932, and remained as such for almost 500 years. It's the southernmost city in DPRK. Kaesong is divided into old and new areas. The population has shrunk from a high of 800,000 to about 335,000. The Inter-Korean Joint Liaison Office was opened in 2018 in Kaesong, which was the first channel for full-time personal contact between the 2 countries. North Korea blew it up in June 2020. A statue of Kim Il-sung stands on a high point. The first armistice talks were held in Kaesong in June 1951 before being moved to Panmunjom. We were only 8 kilometers, 4.8 miles from the DMZ. Northeast of the city center is a complex of 22 buildings that was once the highest educational institution in Korea, opened in 992. In 1987, the complex was converted into the Kaesong City Museum. As usual, we had an attractive local guide in traditional dress. Our home for the night was a Kaesong Folklore Hotel in the Old City. It opened in 1989 with 19 courtyard houses containing 50 rooms, going back to the Joseon dynasty, which ruled from 1392 to 1897. Once all guests and vehicles were accounted for, these gates were closed and locked for the night. The houses are situated on both sides of a stream that flows through the city, along with a restaurant and gift shop. Many of the houses still retain their original furnishings. We had a pleasant courtyard outside our rooms. Some rooms had beds, but most sleeping areas were a mat on the floor, as mine was. I opted for my air mattress and sleeping bag for a bit of comfort. This poster was right across from the hotel and roughly translates as, quote, "Let us protect with our lives the Party Central Committee led by the great comrade Kim Jong-un." Given our proximity to the DMZ, I wasn't surprised to see more political posters, not that the rest of the country didn't have them. Once the Japanese left Korea in 1945, 2 men in Washington, D.C., using a National Geographic map, decided to divide the country at the 38th parallel. Panmunjom, where the 1953 armistice was signed, is only 10 kilometers, 6 miles east of Kaesong, where we had spent the previous night. The DMZ is the most fortified border in the world and has a wall along some sections. It doesn't exactly follow the 38th parallel as this map shows. Since 1974, the South has discovered 4 tunnels the North has dug, which they say are for coal mining. Taking pictures at the DMZ was a bit tricky. A shot looking back at the entrance gate was fine, but not 180 degrees behind me where there were tank traps and armed guards. Once through the gate, there was an obligatory stop at a building where we were giving a crash course of the Panmunjom area. The gate in the previous picture is on the right, and the DMZ runs north-south at this point. The guide is explaining buildings in South Korea because they certainly weren't going to give away any secrets about the North. I had to ask to take this picture because of pillboxes and whatever else the DPRK doesn't want photographed. I was surprised to learn that 220 families were working co-op farms in the DMZ. The flagpole in the back was built after the South erected the pole 98.4 meters, 323 feet tall. DPRK bettered that by building theirs 160 meters, 525 feet tall, making it the tallest in the world for 10 years. It's since been reduced to the fourth tallest. Panmunjom used to be a larger village than it is now. The building that is now the North Korea Peace Museum was constructed in 5 days in 1953 by the North to host the signing of the Armistice Agreement. UN delegates sat at the table on the left, and Korean People's Army and Chinese People's Volunteers were on the right, signing the Korean War Armistice Agreement on 27 July 1953. The cavernous building still has the original tables, and the UN and DPRK flags are in a glass case on the right. The walls are covered with photographs, maps of the war, and documented proof of US aggression. Unlike most places in DPRK dealing with the military, we were encouraged to take pictures with soldiers and officers. The Army officer was probably a senior lieutenant. The engraved monument to the right has an important message. The translation is, quote, "It was here on July 27, 1953, that the American imperialists got down on their knees before the heroic Chosun people to sign their ceasefire for the war they had provoked June 25, 1950, unquote. The military armistice talks hall was specially constructed in the early 1950s for negotiations. It hosted 158 meetings between October 1951 and July 1953, when the armistice was signed in the larger building. This is a table with 10 chairs where peace talks were held. As a senior member of our group, the Koreans had me sit in the center seat on the south. My new best friend and I are standing before the monument to autograph. This is a replica of President Kim Il-sung's last signature, where he expressed his wish of reunification of North and South Korea before his death in July 1994. The lieutenant was on our bus as we moved through the Panmunjom area, and he and I had a long discussion about reunification through a translator. Continuing down the road took us to our last stop within spitting distance of the DMZ. This building is called Panmunjom and was completed in 1969. Other than using the stairs to gain access to the balcony, we didn't make any stops inside. This is a view from South Korea. The concrete curb in the center is the actual demarcation between the two Koreas. We're looking from DPRK into South Korea here. This is called the Joint Security Area, about 2,600 square feet large and roughly circular in shape. It's the only place in the DMZ where North and South security forces stand face to face. Freedom House is a large gray building in the center, the equivalent of the one we were standing on in the north. This is where Trump walked across the border and met with Kim Jong-un on 30 June 2019. They are both standing in North Korea. One of our group had been on the south side of the DMZ earlier and reported that photography there was highly restricted. The attitude in North Korea was, take all the pictures you want. Turning to the right, we're looking at the village of Daesongdong in the south with their tall flagpole that provoked the north to build a taller one. And that brings us to the end of my DPRK visit. Any comments, questions? Any of you like to go there? Frankly, I'd like to return, but impossible.
I was stationed in Korea in 1965.
Ah.
And we were given I was on a service club tour to Panmunjom.
Uh-huh.
And I remember there was a meeting between U.S. representatives and North Korean military uniform people in one of the buildings when we were there. We were allowed to take pictures in the joint security area.
Okay.
Which include portions, both the joint security area included areas both on the north and south sides of the DMZ.
Mm-hmm.
And we were allowed to wander freely within the joint security area.
Okay.
And take pictures at will. But one thing I will tell you is that while I was in a little group with some other American soldiers and a North Korean jeep with North Korean military men and zoomed by us at very high speed, kind of to intimidate us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a different world there.
Yeah.
It's a different world, and I'm glad, it's nice to be able to get into it, but it's better to get out of it, because I never felt unsafe there, and as long as you play by their rules, no problems. But like Otto Warmbier, he decided to steal that stupid poster when you can buy them in the bookstores. And they let him get away with it until he got to the airport to leave, and that's when they arrested him. So it could have been prevented. Thank you for your input.
Yeah, we were told not to talk to or make gestures to the North Korean soldiers.
Yeah.
We mixed with them physically.
Yeah.
Both U.S. soldiers and North Korean soldiers were looking in the windows of that building where the meeting was taking place.
Yeah.
But we, or at least I, avoided touching any of the North Korean soldiers.
And
although I have pictures of them. But
well, that was different here. As a tourist, we shook their hands, we could put our arms around them, we could cozy up for them for pictures, but you being a military person, of course, put a whole different spin on it.
we didn't fraternize with them.
Yeah.
We were told not to.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, you had a question?
Yeah, you talked about getting in was real easy, but is it hard for Koreans to get out?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
I mentioned that we had 4 guides and a driver, so it was almost a 1-to-1 ratio. 3 of those guides had lived outside of North Korea. Miss Ree, which was my favorite and spoke the best English and was the most pleasant to deal with, she and her father had been in Peru, and she attended high school there. I don't know if she graduated. I can't remember. Another one of the men had lived in Libya and some other countries. And the reason that the Koreans allow them to go there is for business reasons. And I emphasize with Miss Rhee, it was her father and she that were in Peru. Their mother and sister stayed in Pyongyang. And that's a connection, because if they have family back in North Korea, they're liable to return and not defect. So, you know, it's okay for them to leave, but there's always that cord, and it's family.
Have to have a reason to come back.
Oh, yes.
And I also have long ago memories of like a severe famine or something.
Well, certainly, that's the thing that, you know, when I was there, nothing of that kind was evident. You know, we were well treated, we were adequately fed, we're very well fed. And as you've noticed in these pictures, people are not in rags and tatters. You know, that was a revelation that much of the Western media would like us to believe, that these people are just, you know, destitute.
Yeah.
Well, they aren't, not that I saw.
And it's probably likely that there was a famine, but it maybe lasted a year or two.
Well, and I think even this last year, I think, you know, looking at reading online news, they definitely have had problems. And due to the lack of cash, they can't buy food readily. So the people are suffering, there's no doubt about it. And the sanctions are not changing the government, they're just impacting the people adversely, same as in Cuba.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if you felt like you got a pretty representative look of the country. But
No.
it sounds like,
No.
so you think there might be people starving there, you just didn't see them, or you think?
We traveled quite a bit. You know, it's a hard thing to determine starvation and famine and that. I saw a lot of peasants in the fields, and I was really keeping my eye out for that kind of a thing. And even the ones in the fields, because all that rice is planted by hand and every bit of work is done by hand other than that cooperative farm with the tractors. You know, when they were breaking for lunch and that, they weren't in tatters. You don't see any fat people in rural areas, let me tell you that. You know, the overweight ones are the bureaucrats in Pyongyang. And that's typical of most foreign countries. You know, the rural people are slim and lean because they're out working, and the urban people are the ones who put on the kilos. No, as far as representative, there's a lot of the country we didn't see, and that's another reason I would have liked to have gone back, but of course it's not available and probably won't be for who knows how long. A part of it is it's illegal for US to go there. So the Koreans wouldn't care. Once they open it up after COVID, they'd love to have us back, because it's like one agency is sending 2,000 visitors. Well, that's a heck of a bunch of euros entering DPRK. But whether or not that's going to happen, who knows?
And you'd see the same sort of scenario again, wouldn't you?
No. No, this trekking tour had been offered once before, and we were the second visitors, and it was never offered again. So for whatever reasons, either we saw too much that they didn't want us to see, or it was too time-consuming for them to set it up, or whatever. I'm sure that the reason was on the DPRK and not on the agency.
How was that company run? Is that a private industry?
Yes, it is. It's actually, it's interesting that their office is in Beijing, but the owners of it, the founder of it, is actually from the UK. They're not Chinese. They employ some Chinese, but they're actually English, British. And I think they're registered in Hong Kong or something to even complicate it further. But since I was in the office, I noticed that they had, I mean, there were Westerners and also Chinese working in it. And in the larger groups, they do send somebody from the agency with the tour. But since we were only 6 people, it wasn't worth it to send somebody from Beijing with us. And we didn't need them. I mean, we had plenty of guides, plenty of handlers. An interesting thing too is that you can or could go to North Korea privately, but of course in a predetermined itinerary, you don't do anything spontaneously there. But at the minimum, even with one person, you would have 2 guides. And the purpose is that one guide watches the other guide, because DPRK trusts nothing and nobody. And that's something you have to get used to when you're there. You know, you have to watch what you say. The cameras didn't seem as ubiquitous as in Beijing, but you know they're there also. And makes you wonder if the rooms are bugged, the hotel rooms. You just accept it. You know, I never concerned myself with it. I never felt unsafe. Love to go back. Ain't gonna happen. Any other questions?
I can talk to you all night again.
Well, yeah, it was a.
When you were speaking to the guide,
Uh-huh.
when you were taking your breaks,
Yeah.
what kind of answers do you think you really got?
The time that I spent with Miss Ree, I think, frankly, I'm glad that my bad knees at that time prevented me from going on that rest of that hike, because I learned a lot from her and her family. She told me about the flat that her family lived in, her sister who was interested in music, her sister's cat who got into Miss Ree's room and crapped in it and ticked her off. Her mother who used to have, what was it? It was pigeons, I think, on the, pigeons on the balcony, and some raptors came and got them. Well, I mean, it's fair game. Everybody's hungry in Korea. And then she switched to raising chickens, and I mean, it was just a trove of information, and just, I kept picking at her, and felt totally safe because we were out under the trees, and I wasn't concerned about any electronic intrusion there. If anything, I felt a bit more concern for her than I did me, because they have to be, they're the ultimate stop point of what goes. So, but yeah, it was a very interesting experience. And at one point, one of the male guides bluntly asked me, so he says, is it true that everybody in the US owns a gun? That's the kind of stuff. I mean, he was being very candid. And I said, no, I just laughed and I said, no, that's not the case. Some people might have 100 guns and somebody like me has none. So, yeah, so they were eager for interaction also, but again, they can only go so far in what they ask. And if they're next to their cohorts, they can't be very candid about it. But at that whole 2 hours or whatever Miss Ree and I were together, it was gold. I mean, to me, that was worth the trip in itself.
Sure. Well, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Nice of you to come. Thanks. Well, there won't be any